On the morning of Friday, September 3rd, 1999, a malfunction at the Windsor Airport Observation Station failed to detect foggy conditions, and subsequently, no fog warnings were issued. The malfunction was not discovered until it was too late. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. That same September 3rd of 1999, there was a massive multi-vehicle collision that resulted from dense fog. On this day in weather history. If you have ever driven the southwest Ontario stretch of Highway 401, you know how treacherous it used to be. Back when I was just a wee lad, I remember my dad cursing how long and hypnotically boring that stretch between London and Windsor was, and also how snow-swept it could be in the winter. But throughout the rest of the year, this area, vast and sprawling with farmland, provided the perfect platform for dense fog, blanketing a section of Ontario's Highway 401 between Windsor and Tilbury. The 1990s were not kind to this stretch of the major highway that runs between Windsor and Chatham. This particular crash was just the most infamous in a slew of fatal crashes that eventually led to significant improvements to that section. But because we are a reactionary rather than proactive species, it was too little, too late for the lives already lost. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective. But oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event, from when it happened, in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, a tractor trailer entered a very dense fog patch and slowed suddenly, causing a following tractor trailer to jackknife. Uh-oh, I've seen this movie before. Here we go. It takes just one, and we are off to a cluster of chaos. OBS showed less than 1 meter, or about 3 feet of visibility at the time of the crash. On any road, let alone a major freeway, that kind of reduced visibility in an arena where megatons of steel and rubber are already charging forward at a minimum of 100 kilometers per hour or 60 miles per hour is going to end in disaster. And disaster happened fast. The initial crash set off a chain reaction of 5 further separate collisions, as other drivers, unable to see the obstruction ahead, continued along in the dense fog and, of course, slammed into everyone else within their vicinity, and this continued for several minutes of uninterrupted twisting steel and carnage. When the fog lifted, there were 87 vehicles in a tangled, mangled mess, many burnt and totally destroyed. Many people were injured while still in their vehicles. Others were struck as they attempted to flee the pileup. In all, 7 people died at the scene, and 1 more died later in hospital. 45 others were injured. The Ontario Provincial Police described the pileup as a massive fireball. In an area dubbed as the hot zone or fiery center, several vehicles were fused together and were so unrecognizable that they had to be traced by their registration numbers. When it was over, that stretch of Highway 401 had to be repaved before reopening to traffic because the road itself had melted. This crash was the last straw. Restructuring took place to help alleviate the frequency of such events. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on this day in weather history. Tomorrow is September 4th, and we're back to hurricanes. We couldn't stay away for too long because there is a history of so many that changed the lives of so many. So tomorrow is the story of a rare event. Normally hurricanes will weaken before hitting land. It's just the nature of these beasts. So a landfall at Category 5, the strongest storm of its kind, is noteworthy. But 2 in the same season? We'll get into it when we bring to you Hurricane Felix that happened on September 4th, 2007, on this day in weather history with me, your host, Chris May.